Thanks for being with us here on Live Now from Fox. I'm your host, Christina Evans. We do know that President Donald Trump is continuing his tour there of the Middle East in Qatar. While there, the president is signing a number of agreements and sitting down for an official state dinner. This visit, though, comes as the strategic Gulf nation finds itself at the center of controversy over a proposed gift to the Trump administration. Fox's Caroline Shively has much more from Washington.
President Trump arrived in Qatar Wednesday, part of a Middle East tour where he's making deals, removing sanctions, and reordering years of foreign policy.
I don't know if you know that you are the first American president to officially to visit Qatar, right? So we're very honored.
Trump making news on the three-nation trip. On Iran, he wants to make a deal to halt the rogue nation's nuclear program, with the U.S. eventually removing crushing sanctions.
But for that to happen, it must stop sponsoring terror, halt its bloody proxy wars, and permanently and verifiably cease its pursuit of nuclear weapons.
On Syria, Trump announced he's already removing sanctions. He met with Syria's new president, who once led a branch of al-Qaeda, but has since denounced the terror group and toppled dictator Bashar al-Assad.
He's got a real shot at pulling it together.
On Saudi Arabia, Trump announced he's scored investments he says are worth between $600 billion and $1 trillion.
Today we reaffirm this important bond and we take the next steps to make our relationship closer.
President Trump also discussed Russian-Ukrainian peace talks in Turkey Thursday. Trump will be in the United Arab Emirates, but hinted he could go there if Russian President Vladimir Putin did.
That doesn't mean I wouldn't do it to save a lot of lives.
Back at home, President Trump is facing criticism for saying he'd accept a $400 million plane from Qatar to use as the new Air Force One. In an interview with Fox, Trump asked, "Why wouldn't I accept the gift?" In Washington, Caroline Shively, Fox News.
All right, our thanks to Caroline Shively for that update. And of course, this has been a trip with a lot of attention on it right now because officially Trump, who was on this is the first major international trip of this term. And now I want to bring into the conversation now Rich Rubino, our political analyst, is going to help us break down all of the ins and outs of some of these headlines that are coming out of this international visit. Rich, thanks for being with us here on Live Now.
Thank you so much for having me on again.
All right, of course. And as we were just saying, this is the first major international trip for President Trump. Several members of his cabinet are also coming along for the ride there to visit some of these Gulf nations. I have to ask you, it's been found out that his last 10 predecessors before this, those who held the office of U.S. American president, have never started off their international trips with trips over to the Middle East. What's the significance of this, and why did President Trump choose this route to start off this second administration?
I think this is where Donald Trump really diverges from his predecessors, really just about all of his predecessors, in that his agenda is more economic. His agenda, he talks about America first. He talks about trying to stimulate the American economy, for example. So he's meeting with leaders that sometimes I think the United States are kind of at odds with in terms of human rights on economic issues. He's doing realpolitik, if you will. He's basically, as opposed to, say, George W. Bush, who talked about ending tyranny in our time, or Barack Obama or Joe Biden, who talked about trying to promote democracy abroad. He's willing to meet with autocrats. He's willing to meet with leaders and heads of state who are not necessarily in the United States realm on human rights. He's willing to do that to try to bring deals home for the United States, and that's just different than his predecessors. And obviously, in a place like Saudi Arabia, while the United States has many disagreements with them politically, when it comes to business, there are many business deals to be done with Saudi Arabia and other states in the Arab world.
Absolutely, and we're sort of watching some of this happen right in front of us. This is when he was sitting down there in Qatar signing some of these documents. We also know that Trump's personal business empire in the Gulf region is also growing at this point. What should we be thinking back at home? Is this a conflict of interest in any sort of way? Have we seen this before with another U.S. president having such a personal financial tie to some of the nations that they're having relationships with?
No, I mean you've had deals, for example, for presidents in libraries, for example, when other countries are giving money to United States or to the United States president. But in terms of anything that is the direct conflict of interest, that this certainly appears to be, there really is not much precedent for that.
And so, as we're watching and looking at some of them as they're sitting down together, let's talk about some of the relationships and deals that they've been making. What is the biggest thing that you're seeing that's come out of this particular meeting there in Qatar?
I think the most important meeting that the president's had is really with the Syrian president, al Sharar. He's somebody that was really an adversary in terms of the United States. He was somebody who had ties, certainly, if you can believe it, to Al Qaeda. But when he took over in this about 6 months ago, and took over after the Assads were in charge for 54 straight years, he really tried to become kind of a reformer or a moderate, if you will. I don't think anybody would see the day when an American president would go and would be praising him. And very interesting, what he did is he lifted the United States economic sanctions on Syria. Now, Syria, between 2010 and 2020, their economy truncated by about 50%. About 69% of the population was at some level of poverty. About 1 in 4 people in the population were living in extreme poverty, and a lot of that was because of economic sanctions. Consequently, today you had people in Syria that were on the streets that were celebrating. This is something that I think that Donald Trump will try to display what could potentially happen in a country like Iran if they were to make a deal with the United States. They too are living under debilitating sanctions perpetrated by the United States. If those sanctions were to be lifted in return, for example, for the Iran agreeing not to go ahead with their nuclear program or something to that effect, perhaps I think this is what Donald Trump's calculus may be. Perhaps there may be similar, and he could somehow lift the economic sanctions on Iran as well. But this is something this is really amazing if you think about it, that Donald Trump is praising a leader that was once had ties to Al Qaeda, but he's really become a reformer.
Absolutely. I want to put this up on the screen as well. This is from the X account of Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt, of course, the mouthpiece there for the Trump administration, acknowledging that President Trump has been meeting with several of these leaders. But at the bottom of this tweet, and again, you see it there, they praised President Trump for lifting some of the sanctions on Syria and committed to working alongside Saudi Arabia as well. We do know ultimately that Syria is seeking to rebuild after more than a decade of civil war. How much does that influence go into this conversation and even the agreement that they now have working together? Syria truly is in a place where it needs to focus on rebuilding if it would like to see itself become a strong nation once again.
Yes, indeed, and they have certainly under 54 years of autocratic rules over the Assad, the father, and then the son. They're now the current leader, who I think a lot of people thought potentially would be under the same, even though they took over militarily, would be somebody who would have ties to Al Qaeda, who would be more of a jihadist, perhaps. He's proved to be a little bit more moderate and able to work with the West, if you will. And interestingly, I think that what Donald Trump would probably hope out of this is that they will somehow, at some point, he will agree to the Abraham Accords, which is countries that somehow recognize the state of Israel. And that's something that I don't think anybody would have expected. Certainly when the leader took to power.
Absolutely. We also know that other international relations are also being affected by President Trump there to the visit to the region. I want to put this up on the screen. This is a live look that we have over the Gaza Strip as well. Can we sort of talk about the relationships between Israel and Hamas and President Trump? Of course, he was talking about negotiation sessions that could possibly happen there. He's been very vocal about his desire to help to end that conflict. Of course, we also got the release of that very high-profile American man who was held there in Hamas custody, Eden Alexander, for so long, since the October 7th attack that happened back in 2023. What do we think about these relations and how it's going to be affected by Trump's visit there to the region?
Well, it's interesting. Part of the reason Donald Trump lost, this wasn't a major reason, but it was certainly part of the reason, is that there was disenchantment amongst some on the Democratic Party, some of the Democratic left, particularly the Muslim community, the Arab American community in the quintessential swing state of Michigan, because the Biden Harris administration had continued to fund Israel. They were very much, they did not, they were very much disenchanted by the humanitarian crisis that's going on in Gaza. So Donald Trump, the weekend before the election, and remember this is extremely critical where he goes. He went to Dearborn, Michigan, with a very large Arab population, and basically said that he was going to try to negotiate some sort of a settlement, that there he would try to negotiate peace, and that there was basically too much war between Israel and Gaza. So fast forward to this meeting. I think that what he would like to do is he would like to try to negotiate, make some sort of a deal with Saudi Arabia, where Saudi Arabia and Crown Prince the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, rather, agrees to somehow permanent normal relations with Israel. Now, the Crown Prince has basically asseverated that he would only do that. That he would only do that under the condition that there is some sort of a binational state, meaning there is some sort of a Palestinian state. That seems to be the flagship issue for a lot of I think the Arab community, is they want there to be some sort of a state, and they want there to be a cessation of the violence currently in Gaza.
And speaking of some of those other Arab nations, we also know Iran is a major player there in the
Yes.
region. And just days after the conclusion of a fourth round of nuclear talks in Oman, Trump did issue a public ultimatum urging Iran's leaders to accept a new nuclear deal or face a return to what he calls, quote, massive maximum pressure. What do we believe could come out of this situation as you're dealing with a country like Iran, having so many disagreements there with other nations in the region, of course, also being a strong player there, as well as it deals with the war between Israel and Hamas, as well as Israel and the Houthis?
Yes, and there certainly was an agreement negotiated by John Kerry during the Obama administration. Donald Trump came into power. He kind of dislodged it, or he nixed it, if you will. He thinks that he can somehow get a better deal. Iran is currently under actually what is a maximum pressure campaign, which means essentially that there are economic sanctions, and the economic sanctions are really having deleterious effects on some of the most vulnerable population of Iran. I think that the Iranian leaders would like to somehow alleviate those sanctions. And I think that Donald Trump will say potentially that this is carrots and sticks. We will somehow do something to alleviate those sanctions, or at least to alleviate the sanctions that were alleviated actually in the late years of the Obama administration. But in return, you have to agree not to have a nuclear program. Now, Iran is averring that their nuclear program is there for domestic purposes, and is not necessarily going to be used for example, to actually be used to bomb another country, for example. So that's very interesting. Israel, particularly the Likud party and Bibi Netanyahu, are very incredulous toward Iran. I think they would rather have no agreement between the United States and Iran. If you may remember, Bibi Netanyahu came to the United States, spoke before a joint session of the United States Congress, and foundationally really talked about Iran, and talked about how he believes that Iran is building nuclear weapons that they will someday be able to either use as leverage, or that they'll potentially be able to use against Israel. So this is something where Donald Trump is somewhat at odds. You're not going to see this publicly, but I think privately is somewhat at odds with the very conservative leadership that's hegemonic in Israel contemporaneously.
All right, as well, I do want to put up some video there on your screen, because as much as they were discussing some of those key international relations, it was more on the heavier political side. Something that also happened, there was a focus on hosting the FIFA World Cup. Of course, we know that Qatar was a nation that held it a few years ago, and President Trump, of course, was there meeting and signing several of those balls, talking about the future of the American relations here. How important is it that they bring up some of these lighter topics as well when they're having these heavy international discussions that deal with things like nuclear powers and really things that could transform the face of the entire world, but also taking time to step to the side to bring up some of those smaller things that bring us all joy, including the World Cup?
Yeah, I think that is something. Certainly, it's obviously not one of the flagship issues. It's not one of the major issues, but it's certainly something that I think certainly would fortify the alliance between the United States and other countries when they talk about, for example, sports. I know that Donald Trump is somebody who is very much a sports fan, but this is something obviously that is not going to be. I don't know how much credit Donald Trump would necessarily deserve or get for this. It's just something that obviously they bring up in a kind of unking casual conversation, but it's really a secondary or tertiary issue to which is really the major issues going on between the United States and the Middle Eastern countries.
Absolutely. We've just been talking here to Rich Rubino, political analyst, helping us to break down the very latest as it pertains to this trip overseas that the Trump administration is currently on. Rich, before I let you go, any final thoughts? Anything else we should be looking out for as President Trump is continuing his trip through the region?
I would just say that economic sanctions are something that gets very little coverage in the media generally, but there's something that really has an effect on the people. They had a lot of effect, for example, they're very debilitating on the Iraqi population in the 1990s. They're very debilitating on the Iranian people, very debilitating on the people of Syria. I think that it's really a leverage that Donald Trump has, the possibility of alleviating those economic sanctions on a place like Iran if they make some sort of a deal. It has a very deleterious effects on the population. It just doesn't necessarily get the coverage. And I think when you look at what's going on in Syria, you really have to look at the fact that there are so many people that are so really deliriously happy that the economic sanctions will be lifted.
All right. Again, it's been Rich Rubino, their political analyst, helping us to break down President Trump's trip over there to the Middle East. We appreciate your time as always.
Thank you so much for having me on again.